let's talk a little bit about why it is that England, in particular, was so absorbed, so focused on gaining land, particularly in comparison to other European colonial powers. Well, I think I said before that there was a population issue, particularly in England. And really, it wasn't so much a matter of overpopulation as it was a matter of moving population, of overcrowding in the cities, as huge numbers of formerly rural people, former peasants from the countryside, were moving into the larger cities, making them larger still. And all this is tied in to the transition in England from feudalism to what's called proto-capitalism, early form of capitalism. So feudalism, I'm sure you're familiar with the term, is the system that was in place in the Middle Ages in medieval Europe. Under feudalism, you have a series of different relationships that are supposed to be reciprocal, in which each layer, here we have a pyramid, each layer owes certain obligations to the ones above them and has certain duties to the ones below them. At the top of the pyramid is the monarch, usually a king, sometimes a queen. So there are lords, the nobility, under the monarch. And those lords have to swear fealty or loyalty to the king, and they are required to provide the king with his army, with military aid as he calls for it. Now their responsibilities are to those under them, the knights. That's the next lowest level. The knights are fed by the they're paid, given food, protection, and shelter by the lords, and in return they have loyalty to them. They pay them homage, and they provide them with military service. Under the knights, you had the peasants, called serfs in places like Russia, where serfs had fewer rights even than peasants did. But essentially, the peasants were the people who lived on the land, who worked the land, and they also owed loyalty to the knights, and the knights technically were in control over that land. Each knight had a certain amount of land, and then all the knights who were grouped under a certain lord, why really then all that land ultimately was owed to that lord, and then from the lord to the king, and so forth. So the peasants who lived in villages farmed the land that the knights controlled, and they gave part of the produce as rent to the knights, and in return, the knights provided them with shelter, food, protection, and so forth. The peasants also owed military service to the knights. So, if there is a war, if the King of England goes to war with the King of France, then the King of England calls on all the lords. They have to come up with armies, each of their own, to provide the king. Those armies are made up of a bunch of knights, but each of those knights is going to provide a bunch of peasant soldiers, foot soldiers. They're not allowed to ride horses. The word for knight in French and Italian comes from the word for horse, so the knights were usually mounted. And then you've got just pikemen, long spears and stuff, sticks sometimes, pitchforks. Definitely not the type of armor that the knights had, which the peasants couldn't afford. So there's this kind of chain through which things travel. And end result is, of course, king sitting there at the top gets the most benefit. But everything depended on control of the land. and what was produced agriculturally on the land, which is why, in the House of Lords, for example, the upper house of Parliament, those titles, the titles the nobility have, which were hereditary, a membership in the House of Lords was hereditary for a very long time, all depends on how much land is attached to that title, what you are the Duke of, or the Earl of, or on the mainland in other European countries, Baron of. And on this land, on the land that was presided over by a particular noble or a knight, then you would have on that land you'd have a lot of farmland, but you would also have, if you'll notice here on this map, in the upper right in green, the common pasture. Now, these other things are pastures, the spring planting, the autumn planting, and so forth. That's to produce the stuff that goes up to the knights and to the lords and becomes essentially translated into wealth, because it can be traded in addition to just sitting around being perishable foodstuffs. But the green area, the common pasture, that's where everyone that lives in the village goes and works, in addition to doing their work for the nobility, growing stuff that they can eat. And then you also have the woodland north of that in this map. The woodlands also were part of the commons. So the woods that were maintained in these domains was for both the lord himself. You see there's another patch of woodland down here on the lower left. But, the lord can go hunting there, but also the peasants can hunt there to get small game to supplement meat, to supplement the vegetables that they're growing. And that's how it all worked. But things started to change. Now, there were a couple of reasons things started to change. One was the opening up of new sea routes that led to new opportunities for trade for more distant lands. Another thing was, of course, the plague. The Black Death killed a bunch of people. That made it kind of hard to have enough manpower to do all the farming there for a long time. And the transition to capitalism, away from feudalism, capitalism meaning that a person who has wealth, sufficient wealth, would invest that wealth in ventures, business ventures that might be agricultural, might be trade, might be industrial, or whatever. And so they invest in that, and that's where their further wealth comes from. Now, what happens here is the peasants get cut out, because as in England particularly, as the nobility and the people with the wealth were looking for ways to expand their wealth in this atmosphere of new trade but declining population, wool became very important. Particularly, there was a big market for wool on the European mainland. So that was a way to make pretty much guaranteed money. Prices for wool also were going up. So what a lot of the nobility did was they fenced off the commons. They fenced off their lands and did not allow the villagers access to that land to do their farming. And they also cut down a bunch of the trees in the woodlands to make that pasture land to raise sheep. And so the farmers weren't able to hunt game there. And eventually it reached the point that, the farmers are kind of getting in the way. The peasants are sort of getting in the way. So the nobility had many of the villages just torn down. Tore down the villages that was on their land, technically. And that left all those peasants unemployed and now homeless. So they didn't have a lot of options without being able to work the land, because they didn't own any land themselves, and there was no way for them to get land, because you have to have money to buy land, and they didn't have money. So they could be beggars, which could lead to serious problems. You could be arrested and thrown into the workhouse, the poorhouse, or they could go into the cities and try to find work, as there was more and more industrial things becoming available. Now, the Industrial Revolution hadn't started yet. It was almost, it was 175 years away. But there was still a growing amount of industry. Along the coast of England, cities that were port cities started to grow because of all the trade that's now going on globally. So maybe you could get a job in one of these manufacturing centers, but you probably couldn't, because there were too many people competing for those jobs. So you can't find a job. You don't have a home. If you don't have a job or a home, you're going to get thrown in jail. Something has to be done. Now, over the course of the 1500s, there had been several peasant rebellions, basically rising up and trying to overthrow the status quo to try to secure some rights for themselves. And that's problematic for those who are in charge, because that's a big chance of the status quo being disrupted. If the status quo is disrupted, your life and your wealth are disrupted. So you've got this huge growing class of poor people in the cities with very little to do, getting more and more frustrated, more and more angry. There has to be some kind of outlet for them. There's got to be some place to send them. And that is where colonization came in. And that's what led to the establishment of English colonies in the New World, which weren't really attempted until the 1580s, which was decades after other European countries had started having colonies there, like France, and in the case of Spain, almost a century. So the 1580s, that's when the attempt was made to settle Roanoke Island off the coast of North Carolina. I think everyone knows how that one ended. It ended in a mystery with everyone disappearing. But the first successful English colony in North America was in Jamestown, in what would become Virginia, in 1607. So there's two things, actually there's three things, going on at once with this settlement. Now, one of the things is that in the 1580s, when they first started trying to establish these colonies, there was a big concern about war with Spain, which in fact was right around the corner at that time, and a desire to have a supply base for British ships, for English ships, that could raid Spanish merchant ships coming out of the Caribbean without being too close to the Caribbean so the Spanish could find them. So that was one thing. Another thing was an opportunity for investors to make money, because that's what this colony was all about, an effort to find gold or silver, or find some kind of crop that would be lucrative for the people who had invested their money in the company. And then the third thing was that it was a destination to which some of those poor people could be spent and could be useful. Now, in efforts to get people to join in on this colonial project, especially after the first one had failed, there were broadsides, basically posters printed up and distributed in London and other cities, trying to get people to join up for this venture to go to Nova Britannia, or New England, and the colony of Virginia, which wasn't actually, settled yet, but they named it already. And Captain John Smith said that in this new colony, every man may be the master and owner of his own labor and land. And that was a very enticing opportunity to own your own land, because, like we talked about, very few opportunities to do that in England, and to own your own labor. You see, many poor people who hadn't been able to find a job had been forced to indenture themselves. So if you were an employer, having an indentured servant was a better investment than having to pay someone wages indefinitely. So basically, when you indentured yourself, you were selling your labor for a period of, depending on the contract, 5 to 7 years, sometimes 8 years. And in essence, you were selling yourself. You were putting yourself completely at the mercy of whoever had the other side of this contract. Now, a lot of people signed these things in order to get across the ocean to that colony, because the promise was made, if you get there, you can claim your own land. That's if you got the money to get there. If you don't have the money to get there, but you still want to have a shot at it, why, then you go over as an indentured servant, accompanying someone, and oftentimes accompanying someone hired by a richer someone, to be their servants and to give them your labor, right? Now, about 2/3 of the early colonists to Virginia came over this way, including my first ancestor to the New World. So that was a nice promise that if you could get, once you got to the end of your contract, however many years it was, 7 was the most common, then you were free and you owned your own labor and you could claim your own land. Well, that's a nice promise, but it didn't usually work out just like that, at least for the first half century or so. Because for one thing, most of those indentured servants didn't live 7 years for various reasons. Starvation, for one thing, in the early years in Jamestown. Conflicts with the local Native American Indians was another issue. Disease, particularly since Jamestown was basically built in a swamp. And then if you did manage to get to the end of your 7 years and get your freedom, well, guess what? All the people who had come over with money had already claimed all the land. All the best land at first, and then all the usable land. And so you were kind of pushed out on the frontier, where you were going to have to contend with hostile Native Americans to be able to claim any land at all. And beginning in 1619, there was also the use of African slaves for the first time in Jamestown. So that's the kind of people that wound up in this first colony, which was in what would later be the American South in Virginia. So you had either middling well-to-do people who came over because they could afford to come over to claim land, much of the land and the produce of which was expected that it would go back to the company that had made the investment, which would go back to the people who owned basically the stock in the company. And those poor people who came over as indentured servants, hoping that they would be able to make a life for themselves and get ahead once they had made it through their years of indenture. And then later, of course, people from Africa who had been forcibly removed from there and forced into slavery. And then over time, they also started using local Native American people as slaves who had been captured in the various wars that broke out. So that's what was going on beginning in 1607 in Virginia. Now, 1620, a second colony was established farther to the north, the Plymouth Colony, in what would later be Massachusetts. And that one is pretty different. We're talking, of course, about the Pilgrims who landed in 1620. Now, they had very different reasons for establishing a colony, whereas the Jamestown colony was set up by a company and was primarily designed to produce profit. And the common folk, the indentured servants that came across to Jamestown, were viewed as one investor put it as the manure that would grow their empire. The Pilgrims were coming to establish their own religious communities, which they were not able to do at that time openly in England, although that would change within just a few years back in England. So, anyway, they also have slightly different relations for slightly different reasons with the local Indians. Now, in Jamestown, there was some conflict at first with the Powhatan tribe. Gradually, over a few years, that was sort of worked out. Trade was developed. What's going to happen with the Pilgrims? Well, let's take a look at one Pilgrim in particular. William Bradford was one of the early Pilgrim leaders, and in fact was the second governor of the new colony of Plymouth. Several years later, he wrote a book called The History of Plymouth Plantation, or Colony. It's like planting people, which gave the history of the first quarter century or so of that colony. And what I want to do now is share with you an excerpt from his book there about the early years of the colony, the part where he describes what was awaiting them when they landed at Plymouth Rock. Now, bear in mind, these folks were landing in New England in autumn. Okay? So, here's what he had to say. Bold parts are mine. They weren't bolded in the original. Here's what he said. Besides, what could they see but a hideous and desolate wilderness full of wild beasts and wild men? And what multitudes there might be of them they knew not. Neither could they, as it were, go up to the top of Pisgah to view from this wilderness a more goodly country to feed their hopes. Now, let's have a little Sunday school review. If you are not familiar with Pisgah, Mount Pisgah, that's the big mountain on the edge of the Promised Land where Moses, the elderly and dying Moses, was taken by God so that he could at least see the Promised Land, which he wasn't going to be able to enter. Okay? So Bradford is saying, we did not even have a Pisgah to stand on and look out and see some promised land, some promise of any kind of good land. For which way soever they turned their eyes, save upward to the heavens, they could have little solace or content in respect of any outward objects. For summer being done, all things stand upon them with a weather-beaten face, and the whole country, full of woods and thickets, represented a wild and savage hue. Oh my God, we got here and summer's over, it's autumn. What a desolate wasteland New England is. Well, to him it was. To the Pilgrims it was, because their view of nature was that it should be dominated by man, that it should be controlled, that it should be transformed, not chaotic and just doing whatever it wants, which is what was going on there. And then the people living in the woods, the Indians, according to the viewpoint of the Pilgrims, they were chaotic as well, just doing whatever they wanted, under no form of godly spiritual control, at least not that the Pilgrims recognized. So, I mean, it sounds like they got dropped down in the middle of Death Valley, but we know, at least from the way we look at things, that it's a beautiful, beautiful area. Would have been more so then. Well, that is one way of looking at things. All English people weren't Pilgrims or Puritans, and didn't all look at things necessarily quite that same way. Now, shortly after the establishment of the Plymouth Colony, 2 or 3 years later, another Englishman moved into the neighborhood. His name was Thomas Morton. He was a supporter of the king. Now, there was already starting to be conflict, tension in England between the Puritans and the king that would lead by 1640 to civil war. So he was a royalist. He was a good friend of Ben Jonson, and if that name is not familiar to you, Ben Jonson, along with Christopher Marlowe and William Shakespeare, were the preeminent playwrights in London at that time. Now, he was not a Puritan. He was about as far from being a Puritan as you could get. And not only that, he didn't like Puritans at all. And that's all because, well, his stepson, his wife's grown son, was a Puritan and converted his mother to Puritanism, and that's when all fun ended at Thomas Morton's house. Thomas Morton, kind of a typical Englishman of the time, he liked to go down to the pub and have a pint. He liked to have a good time. He liked to dance. He enjoyed Christmas, things like that, pagan stuff that his wife wanted nothing to do with, and there were so many arguments that they wound up separating and getting divorced. Actually, I don't know that they ever got divorced, but they certainly separated. So, he had a strong dislike for Puritans. He believed they should mind their own dadgum business. He set up shop not far from the settlement there at Plymouth, and set up a trading post, essentially, on this high hill that he named Marymount, because he intended for it to be a fun place. So there at Thomas Morton's station, if you were to drop in, why, you would see sailors, because English ships from well before the establishment of Jamestown, English ships had been going up and down the coast and trading with the native peoples or fishing. So you might see some English sailors hanging out there. You might see some members of the local tribes, because Morton really thought highly of Native American culture. He thought that there was a lot that the English could learn from the Indians, particularly in their interaction with nature. Pilgrims weren't real big on interaction with nature unless it was to control it. Well, he started having regular parties there at Marymount. And again, if you were to just drop in during one of these parties, you would see people drinking and even, heaven forbid, dancing. And by people, I mean English sailors, yes, traders, and also local native people, including women. All of them dancing together at the same time. Heaven forbid. So then Morton did what the Pilgrims regarded as essentially the last straw. he erected a maypole there at Marymount. Now, fewer people know what a maypole is nowadays. Maybe you're familiar with the concept. It's on May Day, the 1st of May. This pole goes up. It's all brightly decorated, and these little streamers come out the top, and the little children hold on to the little streamers and dance around singing May songs. Okay? Still done sometimes. My church I attended in Illinois had a maypole, and I felt compelled to explain to them, just in case they were curious, what it actually is. You see, that was a tradition that predated Christianity in the British Isles. It was from the original religion of the people of the island, something that the later Christians would refer to as pagan, and it was a fertility symbol. That's why it's erected in May, at the beginning of spring, and this whole ceremony, this whole celebration was part of a ceremony, part of a ritual, trying to make sure that crops and your livestock reproduced in the coming months, reproduced abundantly, and people too, while you're at it. So that big pole that's erected and represents reproduction is what is known as a phallic symbol. It's a giant penis. So far as the streamers coming out the top of it that people grab a hold of and dance with, I will let you figure that out on your own. But the Pilgrims figured it out. In fact, they knew what this was. Now, Pilgrims, let me kind of emphasize here, Pilgrims were against Christmas because it had too many pagan things associated with it, like evergreen trees. This freaked them the heck out. It just infuriated them. It was very representative of the kind of wild, debauched, orgiastic parties that Morton, at least in their opinion, was throwing there at Marymount. And so a bunch of pilgrims from Plymouth got together and marched on the little settlement there that Morton was running. And they took over the little town, and their intention was to kill Thomas Morton because they were really mad, but they didn't kill him. They were kind of scared to, because he had friends in high places, and was known to be very loyal to the king. So they might get in too much trouble if they killed him. So instead, they beat the crap out of him and stranded him on a deserted island, which fortunately for him, an English ship passed by not too long after that and rescued him and took him back to England. So they tore down the maypole, and they tore down everything, and they renamed the hill, changed it from Marymount to Mount Dagon. Now, if you're not familiar with Dagon, here's another Sunday school refresher. Dagon was the Philistine fish god that the Philistines offered human sacrifices to. So that's the biggest insult the Pilgrims could think of to name a place. Well, this is a pretty interesting story, and it is very illustrative of the attitudes the Pilgrims had toward the native people they were encountering, and toward wilderness, and basically toward any kind of behavior that they did not approve of. Now, remember how Bradford described the landscape. It was just a hideous, awful, abandoned wilderness that just made the hearts of men just melt in despair from looking at it, because all it was trees and stuff. Well, Morton also wrote a memoir, and I'm going to read a portion of that to show you his attitude about the place. He said, "In the month of June, 1622, it was my chance to arrive in the parts of New England with 30 servants and provision of all sorts fit for a plantation or a colony. And while our houses were building, I did endeavor to take a survey of the country. The more I looked, the more I liked it. And when I had more seriously considered of the beauty of the place with all her fair endowments, I did not think that in all the known world it could be paralleled. In my eye, 'twas nature's masterpiece, her chiefest magazine of all, where lives her store. If this land be not rich, then is the whole world poor. So Morton's reaction to the countryside was probably similar to what most of ours would be. Holy smoke, this is beautiful. This is just the most beautiful place I've ever seen. And far from saying that it was diabolical or absent of God, like the Pilgrims viewed it, he looked at it as proof of God because of how beautiful that it was. Now, this kind of conflict, this kind of dichotomy in viewpoints toward the wilderness are going to establish some patterns that are going to continue down through American history. There are the industrious pilgrims who have the Puritan work ethic, which essentially says that there is predestination and God already knows if we're going to heaven or hell, and we don't know, but we can't change it. But if we are rewarded materially by God, that's good evidence that we're heaven bound. So the harder you work, the more industrious you are, the more godly you are. While there will be other people who will feel very constricted by that type of attitude and by those types of controls on their behavior, and they will look longingly into that wilderness to the west of them, and will want to go forward and see what's there.